Thank you. Glad to be here in Colony on this rather crisp January day. There's an old saying that no matter how popular you are, the size of your funeral is going to depend on the weather. So I'm so glad to see so many of you with the temperatures hovering around -8 outside as a low. 1960, 3 presidents, 3 very different personalities, 3 ambitions, all ultimately for the same office, the White House, the presidency, the leadership of the free world, as they used to term it back then. But the ambitions are vastly different. John F. Kennedy, his is an ambition of a dynasty, in some sense a political dynasty, also a financial dynasty. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, had wanted to be the first Catholic president of the United States of America. His ambitions get derailed around 1940 as he picks the wrong side of the isolationist debate going into World War II. And he transfers those ambitions to his son, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., who in August 1944, in an effort to equal his younger brother JFK's wartime exploits on PT-109, is piloting a bomber across the English Channel filled with one of the, perhaps the greatest load of TNT in the history of mankind. And somewhere across the English Channel, that plane blows to bits. They never find a piece of him. Windows are shattered in buildings in London. The explosion is so severe. And that is the end of that part of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr.'s plan for the presidency. Those ambitions are transferred to John F. Kennedy Jr., who up until this point never saw himself as a politician, saw himself as a writer, a historian, a journalist perhaps, not quite sure what he was going to be, a bit of the dreamer. But when Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., old Joe, wants you to do something, his sons do it. And in 1946, he runs for Congress. And by 1960, the ambition, which was not his for the presidency, is. He's ready to run. Lyndon Baines Johnson belongs to a different sort of dynasty, a different sort of ambition. His family was a dynasty on the way down. His family had owned land and owned slaves in Texas and in the American South. And his father, Sam Johnson, had been a member of the Texas state legislature. But he works his way down on the social and political scale. When he's in the legislature, Sam Johnson sponsors a bill to have a road constructed near their hometown. And by the time that road is to be constructed, Sam Johnson is not only a former member of the state legislature, he's working on the road crew doing manual labor, hauling dirt on his back, pushing wheelbarrows. That's how far the Johnson family had fallen so very, very quickly in Lyndon Johnson's youth. And Lyndon Johnson, sort of like Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, well, Lyndon doesn't promise never to go hungry again. He promises never to be the idealistic fool his father had been, who had played a promising political career into working on that road crew. And Lyndon vowed he was going to succeed, and he was going to succeed not only in the most nefarious of ways politically, but also that he would let everyone know how clever and nefarious he was. He works himself up from congressional aide to congressman to United States Senator. In 1948, he's elected to the U.S. Senate by 87 votes. And those 87 votes are highly fraudulent. They know him as Landslide Lyndon for the rest of his life, even after he's achieved a very great landslide of his own in 1964. But he then becomes Senate Majority Leader and makes that into a position of great responsibility and power. Unprecedented, really. He's the #2 most powerful person in the country in the 1950s. And He wants to be president in 1960 a lot. The third ambition is of Richard Milhous Nixon's. And as his story begins, the ambitions are very small compared to JFK and to LBJ. He's just a typical American. There's no dynasty there. His family isn't going up or down. His father had been a streetcar conductor in Ohio who moved to California to get away from the cold and the frostbite he achieved on those very cold, unheated trolley cars up north. Richard Nixon goes to school. He does well. He's a great student. He's a musician. He excels in debating in high school and at Duke University. He wants to be an FBI man. Gets accepted, but then they say, no, actually we changed our mind. You can't be that. He ends up as assistant corporation counsel or city attorney for the city of Whittier, California, and that appears to be as far as he's going until World War II, when he, like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, enrolls in the Navy. He comes out, and 1946 is a great year for veterans running for office. Young, ambitious, intelligent, energetic veterans. So he runs in 1946, is elected to Congress in a very rough campaign, and stumbles into what history now knows as the Alger Hiss case. Alger Hiss had been Assistant Secretary of State, very promising fellow in the New Deal, and in 1948, another fellow named Whittaker Chambers testifies before the House Un-American Activities Committee that not only was Alger Hiss a communist, but that he was an espionage agent for Joe Stalin's Soviet government. Most people think this is far-fetched. It can't be. Richard Nixon at first is one of them, but after listening for a little more to Alger Hiss, things don't add up. He investigates the case. Hiss is ultimately convicted of perjury. Richard Nixon goes on to the United States Senate in 1950 and in 1952 to the vice presidency of the United States. He's 39 years old. He's very young. And he, by 1960, wants to be president of the United States as well. There have been a lot of comparisons between 1960 and 2008. These things start out with primaries, as they often do. 2008, the primaries seem to go on and on and on forever. In 1960, it was very different. The primaries had started during the progressive era before World War I, and over the decades had lost popularity. By 1960, they were kind of at their valley of popularity and of their utility. So in 1960, Richard Nixon faces no primary opposition. Now there's a reason for that. In 2006, the Republican Party took a beating in the congressional races. In 1958, the same thing happened to the GOP. Dwight Eisenhower was president, but this was still basically a Democratic New Deal nation. And in 1958, the GOP had worn out its welcome in House races and Senate races and gubernatorial races, eliminating a lot of potential opposition for the nomination for Richard Nixon in 1960. One fellow whose reputation was made in 1958, though, whose political career started, was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller's. He's governor of New York. He's bold, he's brash, he's energetic, he's very liberal, and he's very wealthy. And he wants to be president in 1960, but the more he campaigns, he finds the less support in the Republican Party, so that by December 1959, he pulls out of the race. And when he does this, what that does is to suck all the air out of the Republican nominating process. It deflects any attention from the Republican race because there is no race. It's much like what happened after John McCain secured the nomination in 2008, very early, and then everyone focuses on the very hotly contested Democratic race. And both John McCain and both Richard Nixon needed the publicity in 1960. So in 1960, all the attention goes in the primary season to the Democratic side of the aisle, and that is really, when we talk about primaries in 1960, we're talking plural, we're talking